Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the New Polis for another critical conversation. My name is Roger Green, and I'm the general editor for the New Polis. And today we have guest speakers Tink Tinker, who's been a critical conversationalist of us with us before, and he's written a number of articles on the New Polis, including one that I reference all the time, titled "What Are We Going to Do with White People?" And Glenn Morris is from CU Denver and runs the Fourth World Center for Indigenous Law. And to, today the discussion is going to be about an American Indian critique of sovereignty. So I'm not going to spend much more time introducing the folks. There's more on the announcement for the site. I do want to just alert people to the next critical conversation, which will be March 16th. It will be with Jonathan Fardy and a couple of respondents on his book, which is Althusser and Art. The talk is not about Althusser. It's about what is this thing called theory and what is its usefulness today. And then I'm going to post again in the chat here as we're going for people to look at a call for proposals and papers for our conference in April, which will be April 14th and 15th on decoloniality. And the disintegration of Western cognitive empire. And so this talk and a number of posts on the New Polis have been building up towards that particular conference in April. And I'll just pass it over to Tink. I think he was going to start first this morning. Thanks for being here.
It's really good to be back in a conversation with New Polis, Roger and Carl, and good to be paired up with my colleague Glenn Morris from UCD. Sovereignty, native sovereignty, incredibly complex word. Yet wherever you go on the internet, you'll find native sovereignty being parroted, particularly by native politicians and native speakers. It gets thrown around like everyone knows what sovereignty is and what native sovereignty is in particular on those sites. I'm going to start off by suggesting that the word is so problematic that natives should not use it. There are two particular problems that I have with the word in any native discussion of the word. Both have to do with language. It's quintessentially a eurochristian word, that is, a white word. And that's the article that Roger mentioned. What are we going to do with white people? I prefer to use the word eurochristian. And whatever else it signifies something. Hello? With that particular worldview.
This is what we're focusing on this.
Everyone mute yourselves, please. Thank you. I'm going to, just 1 second. I'm going to mute everybody, and then I'm going to unmute you, Tink. Tink, you need to unmute yourself, I guess.
I can do that.
Okay, there we go. All right. Thank you. Sorry about that.
So I was arguing that sovereignty is quintessentially a Euro-Christian word, and whatever else it signifies something within that particular worldview. And by worldview, I'm indicating again that it's a linguistic problem. There does not seem to be any equivalent word or terminology in any native language for the Euro-Christian word sovereignty. So natives have to borrow the colonialist language and terminology in order to express their resistance to the colonizer's power. In other words, we're using the colonizer's worldview in order to resist the colonizer's worldview. That's incredibly awkward at best. In one sense, it's the best we've got right now. So it's a political choice that a lot of Native leaders make and other Native speakers. And I'm arguing it's time to make a different choice, to abandon the word sovereignty. It's like the term federal Indian law. There are about 10,000 Indian lawyers functioning across Turtle Island in the US and Canada. Well, in the US, because federal Indian law is a US term, who seem to think federal Indian law is Indian law. And of course, it's not. It's white law, Eurochristian law, about how to best control the native populations of Turtle Island. So the first key problematic has to do with explicit with worldview and the extent to which using sovereignty immediately necessarily abandons the native worldview in favor of the colonialist Euro-Christian one. Cognitive linguists in this case have usefully described the unconscious framing that happens within a language community. And they reference idealized cognitive models that already shape our terminology and our sentences before we actually utter them. And foundational, according to George Lakoff and Mark Johnson and company and others, the up-down image schema is foundational. It's predicated on physicality for them. Walking upright implies this up-down image model. The problem with Lakoff and Johnson is they have not been exposed to native worldview, and they're prematurely universalizing their own Euro-Christian worldview as good for everybody. But in their mind, walking upright then dictates all kinds of up-down images from the rising of heat to feeling high or feeling low, feeling up and feeling down, to political and business structures, church structures, like the hierarchies in a corporation where you have a CEO at top and then middle management and at the bottom labor, or U.S. government where you have a president or a king at the top, royalty or the Congress in the middle layer, and the voters or subject people in the lowest order. In the church, you've got not only a pope or a bishop at the top, and then clergy in the middle and lay people at the bottom, but you've got a super hierarchy, because above the pope you have this thing they call God, the white male sky god, if you will, residing above everyone else in the heavens. And of course, the quintessential model of the word sovereignty comes out of the 1648 Treaty at Westphalia, where the sovereignty of the monarch is highlighted and underscored, but it's immediately predicated on the sovereignty of God. So it begins with their theology and becomes political science secondarily. The monarch is then invested by God to be the sovereign over a particular nation state. And you have the divine right of kings, which gives way in 1776 to the United States and their reinvention of sovereignty by this rebel conglomerate who invent this modern governance of the republic and of democracy and invest sovereignty in the people. The sovereignty of the nation state itself, the sovereignty of a country, or in Europe, then that surfaces in Germany, for instance, as the sovereignty of parliament. So what does it mean, this up-down image schema? It becomes so abstract that there's no simple meaning. It takes a large book of 400 pages, unless you're a German scholar. In that case, it takes a 3-volume set titled Einleitung des Souveränität. I can't even say the word anymore. I used to speak the language. The introduction to sovereignty. A second linguistic problem is really closely related, and it has to do with the character of the communication within a particular worldview. To say that languages aren't codes for one another is too easy an aphorism. I think people still treat languages as codes. For English, for instance, native languages are, that people want to know, what's your word for God? That's presuming that we have in Osage a word for God. And of course, that word is totally lacking until the missionaries come and they pick one, because they need to make Osage a code for Catholic English. And Protestant missionaries do the same thing and work kind of, even though they pick different language for different things, their word for God is always the same. So Wakonda becomes the word for God. But the underlying problem is that Euro-Christian languages function around nominal abstractions. They're nominal languages. Again, look at German, and all the nouns are capitalized. It's not quite so apparent in English, but it too is a nominal language, and nominalization is a prime worldview, prime linguistic worldview for creating abstractions. Abstractions like the state, like sovereignty, like religion, like theology, like God, like prayer, like sin and evil. All of those are abstractions, and none of them have counterparts in any Indian language until the missionaries make up words, make up new Indian nouns to carry the weight of Euro-Christian abstractions. Indian languages are verbal languages. Everything involves the whirling, unfolding of life in action, in verbal action. So it's all very tangible, and it's happening now. It's in the real world. So Indians are radical materialists, I've often said, and I know that's a Euro-Christian abstraction, but everything has its own life. Everything has its own reality. Everything is everyone, every person. It's all alive and is my relative. So it's really hard to take over the word abstraction and make that some kind of American Indian verbal quotient involving action, because it has to speak to some sort of nominal abstraction that exists in the invented Euro-Christian ideology and worldview. I'm going to stop right there and let Glenn take it for a while, and we can come back in and discuss what really needs a couple of weeks instead of 2 hours.
That's no joke. Abajang katapin we can tapusi manatusi katulik wislopa. Winishi gugumtana. Winishi wisimanatu. Nemetsto. As I begin, I'd like to first give thanks and acknowledgement to the peoples of the territory where I'm speaking, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the Utes, and the other original peoples of this territory. And I dedicate this work to the continuing decolonization and self-determination of Indigenous peoples everywhere. And I submit these ideas in that vein, acknowledging that my presentation, and I want to say I apologize at first because I know that Tink advised me that we have a 5 or 7 minute introductory comment period, and then we'll open it up. So this is going to be a rush because this is part of a much larger project that I'm working on about exactly the points that Tink was referencing. So Roger, feel free to give me the high sign when I've gone too long here. But as Tink mentioned, even a cursory search of the term tribal sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, Aboriginal sovereignty, Native sovereignty, Hawaiian sovereignty, food sovereignty indicates that certainly since the 1970s, the juncture of sovereignty with Indigenous peoples, often without substantive definition, as Tink mentioned, or explanation, has become ubiquitous in law casebooks, in Native media, in tribal council meetings. And the cursory search indicates that over 200,000 references have been made in some scholarly discussion of Native or tribal sovereignty just in the past decade and a half or so. While I was at Standing Rock in 2016 opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline with tens of thousands of other Native and non-Native people, I watched and listened as several Indigenous people, ranging from teens on Facebook to elected officials of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, using the term sovereignty in myriad contexts. When I asked them what they meant when they described either a perceived assault on tribal sovereignty or the assertion of tribal sovereignty, the reply would be generally something along the lines of, I mean freedom. I mean the ability to make decisions independently without interference. Or I mean the power of our people to control our own destinies over our territory and resources. And then I asked them, so why don't you simply use the term freedom or independence or self-determination to describe those conditions? And they would often respond that one term was as good as another, and the lexicon seemed interchangeable, but that sovereignty sounds more authoritative and much more politically substantial and effective and legitimate. And when I asked them if any of them could tell me what the origins of the term were, or where it originated, or the actual elements of sovereignty historically, not one of them could. Not one of them knew Baudin, or Botero, or Hobbes. Not one of them knew Vattel. And so I considered that problematic, and I considered it problematic because, as Tink was mentioning, if we don't know the genealogy of the terminology and we assimilate it as Indigenous peoples into our own lexicon, into our own worldview, into our own cosmological view, if you will, then it becomes particularly problematic. The late, great Lakota author and visionary Vine Deloria Jr. personal mentor of mine, and I know a friend of Tink's and many other Native people on this program. In his books, especially Custer Died for Your Sins in 1969 and We Talk, You Listen in 1970, grafted the term sovereignty onto Native political aspirations. And really in contemporary times, that was the first kind of really popular extension of the Westphalian term sovereignty into the indigenous context in the United States. Deloria later said that his use of the term sovereignty at the time was a novel political device. He acknowledged and recognized that it was a political device to push the debate for Native justice beyond the place where it had been found by him and by others in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, really. And he never thought that it was to be a permanent description of Native political destinations. And so the following year, the American Indian movement, at that time led by Dennis Banks and Russell Means, began to pick up on Deloria's lessons. And AIM issued a bumper sticker that read "Aim for Sovereignty." And that was the first time that as a teen, I had ever encountered the term in an indigenous context. And the concept of sovereignty, which is today taken almost as a dogma around Indian country, was very unfamiliar and controversial notion. And Russell Means in his autobiography recounted the reaction of tribal chairmen at the time at the annual meeting of the National Congress of American Indians in 1970. And I'm quoting Russell Means now. He said, AIM had a slogan, "Aim for Sovereignty." And Bob Jim, who was then the president of NCAI and chairman of the Yakima tribe, took the stage to condemn AIM and the urban Indians for wanting to steal US funds for tribal governments that were recognized by the US as domestic dependent nations. Bob Jim held up one of our bumper stickers, "Aim for Sovereignty." He couldn't even pronounce it correctly. He said, "Here's what we think of AIM and their sovereignty." And he cut up the bumper sticker with the scissors and he got a wild ovation. A few years later, Bob Jim and the tribal chairman who had cheered when he cut up that bumper sticker had learned how to pronounce sovereignty correctly. Some could even spell it, because by then they were starting to use the term to get reelected, end quote, from Russell Means. So in the early 1970s, although terminology such as tribal sovereignty and self-determination were ridiculed by elected tribal chairmen and tribal governments, as the confused jargon of Native academics or radicals or malcontents, especially in Deloria's writings, today the term is ubiquitous, although a common definition of the concepts remain elusive. My contention for this talk and for this work that I'm doing is that the ambiguous and confused assimilation of the term sovereignty into the mindset of indigenous peoples is part of the lexical colonial project of invader states. The part that Albert Memmi and Ashish Nandi refer to as the colonization of the mind. That's why I contend that the time is long overdue for indigenous peoples to abandon the term sovereignty, invader state sovereignty, and by implication, through mimicry, as Homi Bhabha would say, the use of the terms such as indigenous sovereignty or Indian sovereignty or tribal sovereignty or Aboriginal sovereignty. And any connection of sovereignty as a rhetorical concept, as a political or economic aspirational model, or as a delusion of a framework to liberation from the current colonized circumstances should be abandoned. So it is time, as Homi Bhabha and Frantz Fanon would say, to discontinue mimicking the language and the design of the invader state and to stop fetishizing. If you haven't noticed by now, I also encourage the abandonment of the use of the term settler state and its replacement with the term invader state, which in my view is a much more accurate description of the historical and colonizing nature of the state. And to stop fetishizing, that is continuing our irrational reverence or obsessive devotion to sovereignty, which is little more than a medieval, racist, patriarchal, European, political, and as Tink would say, Christian construct that has brought Indigenous peoples little more than misery and imprisonment. To take Joy Harjo's words of reinventing the enemy's language a step farther, I'm going to suggest that we not reinvent the enemy's language here, but that we reject the invader's semiotics of sovereignty and refresh and implement memories of Indigenous peoples as free and independent nations. And so what's important in this conversation is for us to reveal the racist notions of Baudin and Botero, and even before them Machiavelli, and later Hobbes and Locke and Vattel, and as Tink was referencing, Carl Schmitt and his progeny, who just left the White House, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, and other advisors in the Trump administration. And so, because there's a continuous line from Baudin to actually the Biden administration right now, and I can pull out the Biden administration's most recent statement on Indian sovereignty from just last week, and show you the continuous thread. And so, because there are three elements of sovereignty that have been continuously destructive of Indigenous peoples, and that, as Tink mentions, are antithetical to Indigenous values and worldviews and political models. And so one is the notion that the sovereign is, and sovereignty is absolute, unlimited, and perpetual, as Baudin would say in his book Sovereignty, the 6 Books of the Commonwealth in 1576. And then Botero continues that the state is a firm domination over people, and reason of state, which is the other principle that's really should be dissected by Indigenous peoples. Reason of state, raison d'etat, is first articulated by Botero in 1589, in which he said the state and the reason of state is the knowledge of the means suitable to found, conserve, and expand that domination. And so we see in the seminal case in federal Indian law of Johnson versus McIntosh, where John Marshall takes the message of Botero, the reason of state argument of Botero, and applies it to the creation of the United States and the diminishment of Indigenous peoples and the political status and the legal status of Indigenous peoples in order to create the United States, and in order to guarantee the survival. He uses reason of state arguments in order to guarantee the survival of the United States through the creation of federal Indian law, the foundational case in federal Indian law in 1823. And so, and he also uses Locke and notions of the state and the state's ability to impose notions of wilderness and the value of the cultivation of the soil, and dispossesses Native people of that, even though 65% of the world's daily diet today was originally cultivated by Native people. So, so we see these extensions of not only sovereignty in the sense that Baudin articulated, and reason of state, or raison d'etat, as Botero articulates it, but the Nauruan international legal scholar Anthony Angi, who talks about sovereignty doctrine, this entire complex of sovereign notions that are driven by the colonial ethic, the colonizing ethic, has been extended to Indigenous peoples around the world. And so we see that and it's based on what Tink was saying about the civilizing mission. It's driven by the civilizing mission and the perception of indigenous peoples as different and therefore deviant and therefore beyond the pale. Beyond, I'll use that term deliberately from English law. And then the last thing that the last point that I want to say in my introductory comments is about Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt's extension of Baudin and the description of sovereignty and the sovereign as the person who makes the exception. So the state of exception argument of Baudin, of Carl Schmitt, and frankly of the Trump White House, but not just the Trump White House. And we see this reason of state argument that the state, the sovereign, has the ability, actually has the obligation to determine when the law does not apply to the state, but also to create categories of exception of those people who are not protected by the state, who are not protected by the sovereign, and therefore dispensable. When we see that first of all in Johnson versus McIntosh. That's exactly what John Marshall does in Johnson versus McIntosh. We see at Guantanamo Bay of people who can be held incommunicado indefinitely, without charge, without trial, without due process. They're in the state of exception. They've been placed in the state of exception. And cases more close to home of the use of predator drones to kill US citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and his son, his 16-year-old son, who was born in the city where we're meeting today, as a US citizen killed by predator drones, not by Trump, not by Bush, not by Reagan, by Barack Obama. And so they were put in the state of exception. They were beyond the bounds of redemption, according to the state, according to the sovereign. And so what we see here is what Felix Cohen called the bird in the canary in the miner's cage, where certainly what happens to indigenous peoples in all of these contexts can happen to anyone. So I think I think I've said enough provocative things right now, and we can maybe flesh some of this out in our conversation. But I do encourage indigenous peoples to abandon the use of the term sovereignty, not only for the reasons that I've stated, but because it's actually antithetical to the decolonization project and to the liberation of indigenous peoples around the world. Namechto, thank you very much. And thank you, Roger, for the invitation.
And Roger, if it's okay, I'm going to follow up with a couple of comments. Thank you, Witakola Glenn, for a really nice rundown on the word sovereignty and its history. Incredibly useful. I was trying to be short, and I probably short-shifted myself in terms of not clarifying exactly what the shift in worldview is when we adopt words like sovereignty, or words like God, or religion, or prayer, or any of those religious abstractions. I said that the Euro-Christian worldview is that up-down image schema. It's hierarchy, where you have a top and a bottom and a range in between. And the bottom must give way to the top. And as Glenn said, it's the top that declares the state of exception, or in Carl Schmitt's terms, the dictator, the dictator. Now, American Indian worldview is very, very different. If it's not up down, what is it? I've always argued that it's egalitarian, collateral egalitarian. We're on a plane together. There is no up down. It's all horizontal. So as my colleague Glenn has insisted, in my memory for more than 20 years. In the Indian world, there are no bosses. People want to say, yes, but you Osages have a chief. You've always had a chief. And my response has always been, yes. We have a word, Gayega, that you translate chief, and every Osage village had not one, but two Gayega. And they took turns every other day being in charge, kind of like having Hillary Clinton on Mondays and Donald Trump on Tuesdays. So you can see immediately there's a problem there with a up-down hierarchy. If the Gayega, the person you all call chief, is an autocrat, then you've got people making contrary decisions every other day. For instance, it was the Gayega who determined the direction of the buffalo hunt. So the first Gayega says, we're leaving the village in the morning, we're going to travel west. And after traveling west for a day, the second Gayega says, okay, I'm in charge tomorrow, and we're going to travel east. That ain't going to work. You end up back in your village, right? So that somehow these two Gayega have to be on the same page with one another, which is to say their business is to reflect the consensus of the people, not to make autocratic decisions. It's egalitarian collateral, which extends even further than the human beings in the village, where babies are the equal of every Gayega, where men and women are equal, except that women are more valuable than men, because our societies were all originally matriarchal and matrilocal. But it extends to all our relatives in the cosmos around us, so that all the four-leggeds are a part of that collateral egalitarian. All the flying ones are a part of it. All the living, growing things, so that we cannot walk into the forest and cut a tree just because we humans need that tree. But there has to be a relationship with that tree. There has to be a ceremony. There has to be some permission given to take that tree's life in order to use it to do whatever the people think they need to do back in their village, whether it's a ceremony or building a new lodge for a family. If we were going to use the word sovereignty in this American Indian worldview, maybe in my mind, the closest we could come is talk about the sovereignty of the land itself. Because you see, the Eurochristian invaders also, just as they converted or tried to convert Indians to their individualist notions of Christian salvation, went about the business of converting the land into private property. See, they individualized even the land, so that they broke up the sovereignty of the land into individually owned parcels. Another abstraction, another fiction created by the Eurochristian invaders, and a word again for which American Indians have no counterpart. We don't have ownership of anyone. See, it's anyone, not anything. We in Osage, as far as I can tell, have no word for thing, object, phenomenon. All of those come to us from that up-down image schema, where humans have sovereignty over anything in the world. The freedom to exercise sovereignty over trees, for instance, so that they can clear cut a forest just in order to make paper so that they can create new government policies and add to the federal Indian law in order to extend their control by the use of this abstraction of something called law to control on other people. Claro, egalitarian. Enough said for now. Kakuna.
So, I'm noticing just from past Indigenous conferences that we put on with the Native American Justice Council at Iliff School of Theology, a lot of people like Deborah Harry, for example, are in the chat here. So I just want to invite other Native folks who want to comment or expand upon or ask questions of Tink and Glenn, just to open up the conversation a little bit. But I kind of want to prioritize Native folks' voices, at least first, right now. And I think, as people are sort of thinking as well, I think to some of what Glenn was saying, I think that the foundation of the United States, sometimes political scientists use the term dual sovereignty to mean the states' rights versus the federal situation, which seems to me to be a dialectic of devastation for Indigenous folks in Turtle Island. But a question has just come in from Greg Bainey, who says, when so many Native people have had their language forcibly forgotten, how do we go about restoring a Native worldview without using the language/tools of the invader?
I'd like to address that. And I would like to also go back to a point that Tink was making just now. Because I'm very, very empathetic to that view, that particularly in what we call Great Turtle Island or North America, there are thousands of indigenous languages that are either dead or what ethnolinguists would call dying languages. That is less than 1,000 fluent speakers. And so that becomes extremely important. But I want to relate an experience that I had among our Maori relatives in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the discussion that we had about their debate over these same questions in Aotearoa. And there are two terms that get debated about how they describe what Europeans would describe as sovereignty. And the two terms are Tino Rangatiratanga and Mana Motuhaki, sorry. And so Tino Rangatiratanga is comprised of two words, Ranga, which is short for Raranga, which is to weave together when they are making baskets. So for those of you who've ever read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she talks about the braiding of the sweetgrass together in a sacred ceremony that's emblematic of all relations, political, social, cultural relations among Indigenous peoples. And so Tino Rangatiratanga embodies part of that weaving. And Tira, which is the word for group. So Rangatiratanga is somebody who weaves the people together. And the concept of the chief is bound up with the weaving of consensus among people. So, but they don't have the same, it's just what Tink was saying about the Osages, they don't have the term chief. So it doesn't mean sovereignty in the European invader state sense of the word. And and the conclusion is that the English word for sovereignty has no equivalent in Māori. Similarly, mana motuhake means the authority that derives from the land, that is autochthonous, not autonomous, but autochthonous. It springs from the earth, it springs from the land. And Tino Rangatiratanga is what you do on the land. So the mana, or the power, or the strength, emerges from the land, from your relationship with the land and all of life on the land. And so mana motuhake is completely antithetical to sovereignty in the Westphalian sense or in the Schmittian sense. And so they reject, so our Maori relatives reject that. So, and maybe Harry has something to say about that. Oh, so I'm sorry, I never really answered Greg's point. So those indigenous peoples whose language has been devastated, often deliberately because it's considered deficient, and don't have the facility with their own traditional languages to immediately use an alternative, is to partner with other indigenous peoples who still maintain that. Because, and I know that this is very controversial among academics, but most indigenous peoples I know believe in the notion of genetic memory. And so that's now kind of coming out with studies with regard to the transmission of historical trauma genetically from generation to generation. But genetic memory can be reawakened. I think most of us believe, most of us indigenous peoples believe, it can be reawakened. And so even though our languages may be distant from us, there are still indigenous peoples who have those connections, who can help us to remember that. We saw that with the resurgence of indigenous spirituality in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where the invader states made indigenous languages illegal. And so they fell into, they atrophied, and they sometimes were forgotten. But with the emergence of certain ceremonialism, particularly I acknowledge the Lakotas and Dakotas of the Northern Plains, who assisted so many other indigenous peoples in remembering what it is to be connected to the land ceremonially through inipi, through purification ceremonies, through the Sundance, through other ceremonies that other people went back home and uncovered their ceremonialism, uncovered their connection to place. And by connection, by implication, began the process of decolonization of their diets, of their politics, of their economics. And so it's, I believe that it's possible by listening to other indigenous peoples who have begun those projects.
I would add to that we need to remember that the loss of native languages and the loss of culture was very much a part of the intentional planning of both church and state. They did that. It was very successful. Our great-grandparents and grandparents who were in boarding schools were not allowed to speak native language to one another. They were forced to learn English on most of Turtle Island. Late 1700s, early 1800s in California and throughout south of the Rio Grande. They were forced to speak Spanish. They would intentionally take children, brother and sister, and send them to different schools so they could not even speak to one another. Now, in order to reclaim what was intentionally taken away from us, intentionally destroyed by the invader, means we have to start hanging together with each other. Indian people with Indian people. In the city, it's got to be intertribal. There aren't enough Osages for me to hang only with Osages, and some of them are more colonized than I am. At Four Winds, American Indian Council, we spent the last 3 decades trying to bring Indian people together for conversation about how to decolonize our minds, how to decolonize our speaking. And every time I'd get a group of people together and would start rocking and rolling, talking about how to decolonize our language, somebody in that circle of relatives would say, "But Tink, you use this word. Isn't that a colonial term?" And I have to stop and say, yeah, you're right. I'll have to rethink my use of that word, so that my process of decolonizing my mind and my language has been adult life long. I mean, I started life doing a PhD in my mother's religion in order to understand it well enough to begin the process of walking away from it, to my mother's great disappointment. To my father's more open delight. I couldn't keep them both happy, and yet they were married for 72 years before my mother passed. Yes, it's a process of going back to my reservation and speaking to people back there, elders particularly, and beginning to use words and then sentences and listening for how those words are used. And I go home and I critique the way they speak Osage, because as they resurrect the language, too often they're resurrecting wazhazhe as a code for English, so that wazhazhe becomes wazhazhe, the Osage language, instead of speaking Osage, because adjectives in wazhazhe generally follow what they're describing. Little things like that, or the phrase we use for good morning, Carl. I said it's kasiaksi, and of course they rock it like English, kasiaksi, instead of kasiaksi. No longer remembering exactly where the accent should be. And the accent is so slight in Osage, but it's there. And it doesn't rhythm the way English does. So it's a process, Greg, that we engage for a lifetime. Kakuna.
And the next question is related. It's from SH or Shish. And it says, how do Native Americans overcome the feeling of alienation in modern days? I mean, when they have to live among other Euro-Americans. Oh, and Sheldon, I saw you had, did you have a hand raised there? Sheldon spotted up?
In the queue. You can put me in the queue after they answer the question.
Okay, great, I just saw it flash.
I think one of the greatest attempts and actually partial successes that colonialism has had on indigenous peoples, but frankly on all peoples, is the destruction of community. And I mean genuine community. I don't mean some rhetorical community. I mean a genuine community where we care for each other, we depend on each other, we assist one another. And that was the hallmark of Indigenous societies at the time of that invasion. And so as Tink was saying, I'd just like to add one more point, that I see that there are a lot of younger Indigenous people on the in the room here, and they know that one of the admonitions that I give them is to remember that colonialism didn't happen in a day. It was a very meticulous, deliberate set of structures that were imposed over decades and centuries. And so decolonization doesn't happen in a day. Decolonization is also a process. And so, but we have the advantage of being in our homelands. And so it's always possible to rely not just on other humans, but as I mentioned, Robin Wall Kimmerer earlier, her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she tries to remind us of that we gain assistance and we have community, not just with human beings, but with every living thing in our homeland. And and that's where our ceremonies come from. That's where the language comes from, is from our relationship with those things. And I know in a Western academic setting, that seems irrational, or it seems superstitious, or what have you, but it's what has allowed Indigenous peoples to survive and thrive for millennia here. And so from time immemorial, as they say. So I would just say to Shish, whoever that might be, there's a recent book put out by Joseph Marshall III. He's from the Rosebud Reservation, called Crazy Horse Weeps. And the subtitle is The Challenge of Being Lakota in White America. And I think that Marshall in the book, he's writing it particularly for young Lakotas and Dakotas, but the lessons, I think, transcend that and can apply to young Indigenous peoples everywhere, because in this society, alienation from community, particularly Native community, which is distinctly different in my experience than other kinds of community, the regeneration of that community is essential. And so I know that's particularly difficult now when we have to have a meeting like this mediated through this electronic device, and we can't see each other and touch each other and feel the essence of one another in the same room. But it's worth trying, and it's worth continuing to do, because without it, we become just atomized targets. And so that's the lesson that our ancestors gave to us, is to always renew and regenerate those connections that we have to one another. So I just encourage you, not when you feel alienated and you feel like giving up, to try to find or reach out. Here's some community right on here that live in Denver, that live in connection with one another. So I encourage you to try to find that and make those connections.
Yeah, I would just add to that, that it's a matter of finding each other, and communities, to me, again, too abstract a noun. The Indian words that reference our towns reference living together. And community is not what the graduate school where I taught at Iliff School of Theology, setting aside a large room to be the student lounge, creating community. In the Eurochristian world, people are always talking about creating community, whether it's a club or a church, a congregation. We're going to create community, right? Now, Indian people live together. So my fear, my worst fear, is that being Indian in the city becomes like joining a club. I'm being Norwegian in Minneapolis is belonging to one of a half a dozen different Norwegian clubs. Weird stuff, huh? They haven't been Norwegian for a century and a half or more, but about a century and a half. Mute yourself, please. Begonia, thank you. Yet at the same time, they're clinging as white Americans now to some fantasy of being Norwegian, which gets shot out of the water the first time they go back and visit Norway. Whereas natives still have homes. We're welcomed back on our reservations when we go back. And yet in the city, we have to struggle to find one another. We have to find the powwow or find the schedule of powwows, make our way out to Tall Bull Memorial Grounds, or make our way over to Tall Bull, Four Winds American Indian Council or to an American Indian Movement meeting. Those are the places where I found community here, found people that I can live with, people who immediately understand what I'm talking about and whose issues I understand when they speak to me. So that's where it starts. Kakuna.
Thank you, Tink. And just to let everybody know, I saw some hands come up and I've put some sequence into the chat. So we'll take Sheldon next and then Danielle because I saw her hand. But I can't always see everybody's hands because I can't see all your faces. So if you could use the chat, please, so that I'm not leaving anybody out. But go ahead, Sheldon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I guess a comment and a question. The comment is I think me saying this, Sheldon spotted up saying this, is that I think one of our greatest contributions to humanity as Indigenous peoples of America is to teach the world about environmentalism and to teach the world about kinship. And so if you go to any tribal community and you look at some of the immutable values, I use that word intentionally, immutable, some of the core things that make us Indigenous, it is about that reciprocity that we have with the earth and reciprocity that we have with others. There is a growing movement, I feel like, I would say a growing movement, at least I'm law trained, worked in-house counsel for a tribe, currently a tribal judge for a tribe right now. I don't work full-time for a tribe though, but I am a court of appeals judge for a tribe. And so I get to see it from a governance perspective. And I think there is that word sovereignty, and the point that has been well made, the linguistic point about it, it's been stretched. So like it's almost lost its savor in some sense. But if we go to the very core of the way that tribes manifest their governance, there's a growing movement about developing a body of tribal law. And so what that would look like for Northern Cheyenne, I'm a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe. We did have governance, like we still do have governance. We had a structure of 44 chiefs that were based on our societies and they still meet, like their major function today, unfortunately, has been really primarily reduced to running ceremony, setting up the Sundance, our annual ceremony, so but before they had broader governance, and if I guess the legal sense of what sovereignty is that aspect of being able to, this is what federal Indian law would say. So when we talk about federal Indian law, I go to the federal Indian law conference every year. For most of the years I've gone. I don't know if anybody would I don't think anybody would say that federal Indian law is tribal law. I think there is a distinction there. And fundamentally for everybody on this, when we talk about federal Indian law, if you imagine with me, 3 intersecting circles, a Venn diagram of 3 intersecting circles of the 3 sovereigns that are identified in the U.S. Constitution, the federal government, states, and Indian tribes. and what federal Indian law is describing the relationship between those three entities, you know, and how they push and pull and fight for jurisdiction primarily, whether that's taxation or whether that's territory. And of course, that's within a colonial structure. And I think the Johnson v. McIntosh, you read that case, it's the most racist case you might run across, at least in the top 5 easily. So that's something for great federal Indian law attorneys are winning some big battles right now, actually, some big ones that happened even this year in McGirt v. Oklahoma. Something for us to be thoughtful of. But to my primary point is this idea of cultivating tribal law. We haven't vanished. We're still here. When we talk about those fundamental core things of being a Northern Cheyenne, number one is we get to identify who is a member of our government, you know, who has the ability to participate in us. And whether that's a government or whether that's ceremony, that's kind of one of the major fundamental things about who's us and how do we identify us, you know? And so that's one of the very core things about it. But when we talk about like, how does our law replicate our community values? That's some work that I think community members, lawyers, tribal elected officials, scholars, I think that's some space that we really need to be cognizant about. And there's some scholars out there, Christine Zuni Cruz, who's my mentor at the University of New Mexico, the thoughts about being able to get people together. And of course, I mean, being Northern Cheyenne is different in 2021 than it was when we killed Custer in 1876. That was a beautiful day when we did that. And maybe that's also our gift to humanity is that. But the values that we have, there is a diversity in cosmology. There is a diversity in the way that worldview, and being able to take that into account as we craft our laws and be able to create space for what it means for Northern Cheyennes to have a sense of participation in governance. And so I think I would like to see, tribes are doing it. Like I could rattle off some names of tribes that are doing it right now, is this intentional outreach to the 2 out of 3 of us that live off reservation, 2 out of 3 tribal citizens that are off reservation, and how they're reaching out and including us into community. It can happen this way, albeit not as great as being there in person. But also participation in ceremony, you know, and I know there's this intentional, and if you didn't know this, and Professor Tinker does such a great job with this, is just like, there's a whole history here. And if you don't know about it, like, I think a lot of this conversation is going way above your head, but the whole history of the colonization and genocide project of the United States against Indigenous peoples, it's something that you need to know about. But where we're at today, I feel like we have some talented individuals. There's an Indian Renaissance, I feel like, happening, you know, like there's so many different intersections that are happening. It's exciting to see all the artists, all the great thinkers, the lawyers, the doctors, all these things that are kind of happening right now, and the great intersection that we have going on right now in Indian country. Some amazing things are happening in that intersection, you know. If you're not paying attention to it, you're missing it. There's some really cool things that are happening out there when it comes to these types of discussions. So great to be a part of this. I'll leave it at that. That's my comment.
Way, Sheldon, thank you. I think when this pandemic's over, you and I need to find a way to meet up face to face and visit more. And that's not to say we agree on everything, because we would end up arguing very productively, I think. Let me say about environmentalism, first off, my problem with Euro-Christian liberal environmentalism is that the vast majority of Euro-Christians are worried about the environment for the sake of rescuing the future of human beings. That's not particularly a native worldview perspective, because human beings have no up-down hierarchy, superior importance to the rest of the world around us, what Euro-Christians would call the world of nature, right? No, those are our relatives. We're functioning constantly at our best. out of utmost respect for every living being. That is, every plant, every medicine, every squirrel, every sparrow. That's American Indian environmentalism. It's that collateral egalitarian worldview. And I think in terms of I try not to use the word tribes, but when I'm talking about recognized tribal governments, I think we have no choice except to talk about tribes. For me, that's not a native category either. That's a category that was imposed upon our peoples, and it makes Indian peoples, again in that up-down image schema, a notch below Euro-Christian peoples, because they're not called tribes, they're called a nation. And the US government, for its part then, fills its website with talk about honoring this. I started checking it out during the Bill Clinton administration, honoring the government to government relationship between the US government and Indian tribes. Right there you have the hierarchy, up, down. And it's government to government, studiously avoiding the terminology nation to nation for a reason, for a purpose, to make sure that Indian peoples understand you're a tribal government, you aren't a nation. Udall, Stuart Udall's brother, senator from Arizona, explained it this way. Gee, what, more than 50 years ago. Indian sovereignty is kind of like a state or a county. That kind of subservience to the sovereignty of the top, the United States. In other words, an Indian nation under that kind of hierarchical grades of sovereignty is never completely free. So that we're forced, coerced, the way our grandparents were in boarding schools, to invent Euro-Christian ways of organizing ourselves. Yes, we have tribal governments. I mean, the Osages adopted a new constitution a decade ago. And lo and behold, our new self-government is modeled exactly on the US government. I mean, it starts with a principal chief, an assistant principal chief, a national Congress, and a national judiciary. What's that look like? And the last article in the new Constitution read, this Constitution will take effect upon a majority plebiscite of the Osage people and the approval of the Constitution by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. What? What? We can't have a self-government until the Bureau of Indian Affairs says, yeah, that's a good Constitution, you can go for it. That ain't free. That's working with their models of an up-down hierarchy and trying to live within what some of my Indian lawyer friends call, it's the real world. I'm not ready to concede the real world. I want to go back and reclaim those values, cultures, language structures that were ours and use them to talk back to this invader state. Kakuna. And I say that with utmost respect. Jole Wahoe, Sheldon, with utmost respect.
Yeah, I agree with Tink, and I think that this is what I was talking about with regard to building community. I too honor your words, Sheldon, and I think we have many future conversations I hope that we can have about some of these points, because part of community is having this respectful discussion and dialogue. I remember when I first started doing international work at the United Nations to help to develop the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and so on. And the first law review article that I had published was an argument that said that Indigenous peoples and nations should be recognized as states under the Montevideo Convention, the UN Montevideo Convention of 1932. And so I laid out all the criteria, said, you know, Indigenous peoples and nations, they meet these criteria and they should be recognized as states by the United Nations. And it was, you know, through these kinds of conversations with Vine Delory Jr. or Russell Means or Carrie Dan or Janet McLeod or other, John Mohawk, other people who were active at the time, who kind of gently took me aside and said, why would we want to be states? Why would we want to replicate the model of the invaders? And we had our own models before they ever showed up. And the one thing that I want to mention, Sheldon, just quickly is your notion that federal Indian law is about a Venn diagram of these three concentric circles. I would argue that it's more what Tink's talking about. It's a pyramid in which the US state is at the top, and state and indigenous governments are subordinate to that. And because under Article 6 of the Constitution, states are subject to the supremacy clause. So anything that they do that's contrary to the federal Constitution must fall. And similarly, under plenary power or under domestic dependency, indigenous governments are not co-equal governments with the United States of America. The United States could terminate your nation and your reservation tomorrow if it wanted to. It could say you're no longer Cheyennes, you're no longer a reservation, you no longer have a territory tomorrow under plenary power doctrine. And so that's not a co-equal relationship. And that's what I'm talking about here is like, so for indigenous peoples really to express self-determination, and I don't mean and that's another term they've captured under federal statutes, the Self-Determination Act. It means self-administration in federal law, but in international law, it means the right of a people to decide for itself its political, economic, and cultural future without external interference. And so I would say that's what we have to, that's what indigenous peoples must do, is to realize that the use of the term sovereignty as a co-equal with the United States is an illusion. It's an illusion today until there's genuine decolonization and genuine self-determination. And one final point to go to Tink's issue, when on January 26th, Biden issued this executive action. And the title of it is Memorandum on Tribal Consultation and Strengthening Nation-to-Nation Relationships. And so in one sentence, there's a major contradiction, because either there's tribal consultation, and as Tink says, anthropologically, sociologically, the state has already subordinated, the United States has already subordinated indigenous peoples with the use of the term tribal. You look at any anthropological diagram of the levels of civilization, and tribe is under state and under nation, and it is subordinate, it's inferior. And so the use of the term tribal nations is a deliberate device to say, you're not actually a nation. And Vattel says that, and John Marshall uses Vattel in Johnson versus McIntosh. Vattel says that in the 19th century. He says, these tribes, these wandering bands of people, they're not nations. Even though the the United States used the term the Delaware Nation, the Cherokee Nation, the Great Sioux Nation, the Navajo Nation in treaties, Vattel already gave them the out and said, you can use that term, but everyone knows that it's the prerogative of the sovereign to define those terms. And so those are really important conversations, I think, for us to have as communities, as to say, so what might be a better term? What might be a stronger term? What might be a stronger frame that we can use to advance the cause of colonization and self-determination? So I thank you again for your comments, and I look forward to having ongoing conversations with you.
Thanks. And Danielle, you were up next, and then Fernando, I haven't forgotten you. I'll come back to your comment after Danielle. So Danielle, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Ampatu washte. I speak in humble and respect to everybody on this call. Thank you, Tink and Glenn. I appreciate the comments that you made, Tink, regarding bringing pan-Indigenous nations and groups together in urban areas like Denver. And Glenn, you also made great comments regarding a true community among our people. But what are your thoughts regarding the lateral oppression that exists within our communities? I know we don't like to acknowledge it a lot. We don't like to vocally talk about it, but it's a real thing and it exists. And it seems that we have a lot of work to do within that issue before we really approach a lot of these other outside issues. What are your thoughts?
I presume you're talking about gender issues.
No.
What do you mean by lateral?
Lateral oppression within our Indigenous communities, things like, you know, you're not dark enough, you're not Indian enough, or, you know, just all those issues that come up within our own communities, where we, instead of supporting and uplifting one another, it seems we tear each other down a lot.
Yeah, got it. That's part of colonialism. The colonizer has invented that, and we bought into it. It was in the 1880s that the US government fleshed out legally its notion of blood quantum. And their whole intention with blood quantum was to reduce the number of Indians legally so that they had less of a treaty burden of support for those Indians in terms of health and well-being, etc. At one point, you had to be a quarter blood Indian in one tribe, enrolled in the tribe and a quarter blood in order to get services from Indian Health Services. I mean, that's US government meddling. It's their colonialism. It's not enough to be a citizen of a nation in order to get the treaty obligation of the US government to provide health care to that nation in return for taking several million acres of Osage land, for instance. We bought into it, and there are tribal governments today that are busy engaging in internal legal decisions to remove citizens from their roles, who, from what anybody else can see, have every right to be on those roles. That's something we need to address among ourselves again in order to claim genuine Indian sovereignty. I'm light-skinned enough that I've occasionally been the target of that kind of acronym within Indian community by Indian full-bloods who for some reason think that because they're full-bloods, they have a greater right to being Indian than those of us who are mixed blood. Being Indian is being a member of a community, purely. And at some point, we've got to figure that out internally amongst ourselves instead of constantly letting the US government determine who we are. Let me say that much and see what other people have to say about it.
And I agree with Tink that processes of lateral violence are a function of, in large part, of colonialism, and so we can learn a lot from other people who have been in colonial struggle. I mean, when we read Memir Fanon and talking about similar kinds of colonial violence or similar structures that a colonial system constructs in order to create lateral oppression, I think it's important for us to learn those historical lessons and then to update them and apply them to our own circumstances. And so, but I also, I mean, Tink asked if it was referencing gender relations, and I mean, it certainly is that as well, but and something that anyone on here who's been in my classes knows, that's often where I start a class on Indigenous politics or Indigenous political systems, is disabusing people of the notion that there wasn't reciprocity, to use Sheldon's term, reciprocity between men and women, between old people and young people, between humans and other species, other animal nations. And so, and that's what we have to do, first of all, is forget the miseducation that we've received. And that's why Mimi says, and Nandi say, that, you know, political self-determination, that's the easy part. Even economic self-determination, while more difficult than political self-determination, is easier than the decolonization of our minds, because it becomes endemic kind of to it. And it's indiscernible where the line is. Where has Christianity seeped into traditional Indian ceremonialism, so that we think, or even gender relations, that we think that certain mores now are Indian. And in fact, when we start unpacking it, when we start tracing it back, we can see the influence of missionaries on the development of a completely different ethical system. And so we see that in our diets. You know, fry bread's a traditional Indian food, right? Well, we didn't have wheat. If we didn't have wheat, how could we have fry bread? And so, but when you get confined to a reservation and you're given government rations that include some salt pork, a tub of lard, and 50 pounds of white flour, what do you do with it? You survive. But we have to unpack that. We have to decolonize that. And I'm encouraged to see many younger people talking about, I just wish they wouldn't use the word food sovereignty, but talking about decolonizing our diets, and going back to our traditional foods, and creating and expanding native seed banks to help us to remember those things. And so, so I appreciate your comments, Danielle, and I do think that the dismantling of lateral violence in our communities is integral to the future of decolonization.
Thank you. I'm gonna Fernando Herrera in London asked me to read his question. Is in quotes, native or indigenous sovereignty, end quote, perhaps comparable to Black nationalism, something like an impulse, a desire, incoherent if you wish to affirm that something is not clear inside an overwhelming force / frame, etc. Sovereignty affirms, quote, territory What would synonyms be? Is abstraction the enemy? Thank you. He says he's following from England.
First of all, it's not, the Indian context is distinctly not like the Black American context. I don't know about the Black UK context. Black and American Indian are very different situations in the US, even though we partner up as allies in so many political actions. You know, it's not to say we're not in conversation with one another, but our base is the land itself right here on Turtle Island. The real tragedy for American Blacks is that they were uprooted from their land, their relationship to the earth in Africa, and transported over here into slavery. Of course, even as I say that, it should not ever be forgotten that there were more Indian bodies being shipped out of Charleston in 1650 than there were Black bodies being shipped in. So that our ancestors had that experience of enslavement as well. But those of us who are still here on the land, this is our land, not our property, but our grandmother, with whom we have an undying relationship. We can't call that sovereignty. It's, in a sense, yes, abstraction is part of the problem. Abstraction is the enemy. The word religion is an abstraction. The word law is an abstraction. Did Indian peoples govern themselves, as Sheldon has assured us that we did? Of course. Of course. Osages had Gallega. They had non-Gijon, the little old ones. Nahonjinga, I'm sorry. They did have Nahonjinga who made decisions, who sat in council, evidently a lot, talking through the situation of the Osage village. These are old people who've gone through initiation ceremonies and have been elevated. Elevated, it's a bad word because it shows that up-down image schema, but they've been set aside into this council as elders with status to decide for the whole village. But it was never an autocracy because there may have been 70 people in this council at any one time. There were 24 clans. There could be 2 or 3 or 4 from every clan who are part of the Nolshinga. So it's not going to work to compare us to other people. Our situation to that extent is unique. And our task of decolonizing is very different from the African American task of decolonizing. Kakuna.
Okay, there was another question from Shima, or SH, and let me just go back and find it. What do you say about marriage among Americans and Native Americans? Is it another form of colonial sovereignty? And it's Shima, or I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name right.
Tink, this is your
Oh. Yeah, that's a tough one because miscegenation was also a part of the colonizers' plan, a part of the conquest of the continent, a part of separating Indian people from our cultures and our peoples, was to either force or make it in very, very appealing for Indian people to marry non-Indians. That's another distinction between us and African Americans. They had laws to prevent or try to prevent American blacks from marrying Euro-Christians. And yet, just the opposite was the case for American Indians, because it was another way to erase Indian people, to erase Indianness. And I've got to speak carefully, as Glenn knows, because I'm married to a Chicana woman. That's a part of the problem too, because there's no accounting for two people falling in love with one another, deciding to make a life together, to live together. I have to say that my spouse has been very supportive of my work in the Indian world, my participation in Indian culture, my insistence that our home is an American Indian home. And 8 years ago, we adopted a daughter. She's my Mina, my oldest daughter. She's now 12. And we've been very careful to raise Mina as much as possible within this Indian worldview and Indian culture. But at the same time, it is problematic. The more we intermarry with Euro-Christians, the more we get separated from our world, from our worldview, from our culture, from our language. Ideally, I want my daughter and my sons to marry wazhazhe people, to marry wazhazhe men and women. My 3 sons are all married to Euro-Christian. No, 2 of them are married to Euro-Christians. One of them is married in Taiwan to a Mandarin-speaking woman. And my grandkids are probably the only Osages in the universe who speak Mandarin as a first language and speak English on Saturday nights when they Skype with me. But thank you for the question. It is a problem, and I do want to hear what other people have to say about it.
Hi there. Hi, Tink and Professor Glenn. Good to see you all. Good to see everyone else here. I just wanted to add that even though, intermarriage happens, it's still up to the individual nation to determine citizenship. Blood quantum is something that was not created by us. Like Anishinaabe didn't have blood quantum in the past. So if I choose to marry out in the future and marry someone who's not Anishinaabe, my children would still be Anishinaabe and their children would be Anishinaabe. So it's up to our nations to determine who our citizens are. And even if I don't want to use that 1 drop blood rule, that's not the right word to say, but it's what's coming to mind. Even though that might lessen, my peoples would still be Anishinaabe, but it would depend on their actions as well. Like, do they do the things that make them Anishinaabe, or do they do the things that make them colonizer? So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thanks, Tessa.
Well said. Thank you, Tessa.
There's a question from Cynthia Rice that says, should we rethink the term Indian Renaissance? It was used earlier.
Well, yeah. But I don't know. I mean, any of these English labels, I think, but are problematic. But that doesn't mean that in indigenous resistance struggles around the world that people haven't taken a colonizer terminology and turned it on itself. I think about the Kanaks in New Caledonia or Kanaka Maoli people in Hawaii, where the term Kanak was used as a pejorative. It would be the equivalent of the N-word here. And the French colonizers used it against the indigenous peoples. And the Kanaks themselves decided, we're going to possess that term. We are going to reclaim that term. It is a Kanak term, but the colonizer turned it into a pejorative. And so it's our prerogative and it's our right. And now we believe that we can redefine the term. So if we wanted to, define Indian Renaissance in terms different than the European Renaissance, I guess that would be fine with me, but why bother? That is my point with sovereignty. Why bother? Don't we have terms that can describe our renewal, our reemergence, our decolonization, besides having to resort to colonial monikers? And I guess that's my whole point about sovereignty, is that it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary for us to embrace or mimic the vocabulary or the behavior of the invader state. We have a history that comes from time immemorial here. So to go back to Sheldon's point about the Tsitsitas, I'm sure have, just like I was talking about the Maori and Manamuhutaki, they have a term. They don't need sovereignty. I'm sure Tsitsitas have a term. I'm sure the Osages have a term. I'm sure that everyone has a term. Lakotas have a term. Anishinaabe have a term that talks about the ability of people freely to determine their destinies or freely to determine their lives. And so with regard to Renaissance, I think I would view it the same way.
There's some, Sky Morris has some comments in here, and Jesse and Gracie, I'm seeing yes. So I just want to invite any of you to join with your own voices without me having to read out your comments, because you're bringing up stuff about land and territory and decolonization, meaning a return to the land herself, Sky says. So do you want to elaborate on that? Any one of you?
Thank you. It's good to see you all and many of our rabble rousers out in the community. It's good to see you all. Dagote, Sky Roosevelt Morris Onse. My name is Sky Roosevelt Morris. I come from the White Mountain Apache Nation and the Shawnee Nation. And so my comments were kind of in this similar vein of like using terms like Renaissance, because I think the overall principle of what we're talking about is it's more, it goes further than just talking about sovereignty. It's about being intentional with the words that we use when we're describing ourselves and our situation, and being creative in that. And I think we have to be mindful of that. And so it's more than just talking about sovereignty. It's about talking about how we are in this world, where we want to go in this world. And also, this romanticization of decolonization, I would really caution people to not be so quick to use that kind of word or that kind of language because it's sexy. Eve Tuck and Yang, who talk very extensively about decolonization is not a metaphor. when they talk about decolonization, it's about land back. And it's not in a bumper sticker slogan, as my Uncle Glenn would talk about, sort of way. It's about returning the land to herself. And so when that kind of language gets co-opted, I think that that's something I would like to hear more about, from Glenn and Tink, about how even when we do find language that might be appropriate to talk with the non-native world, because this is what this is really about. It's not about it is about us finding our language for ourselves, but it's also about this interaction between us and the non-native world and finding a common language to have a conversation between the non-native world. And even when we do find or try to find some common language with the colonizers, they co-opt that language because it's too confrontational to whiteness and colonialism. And then they water it down like decolonizing your diet or decolonizing your life. And they have no intention of giving land back. They have no idea what decolonization really means. It's just a yoga class that they talk about. It's a feel-good seminar that they talk about. They have no idea what decolonization really means because they don't live it. And that's, I think really fundamental to this conversation is it's more than just words. It's the way you live your life. And that's what Vine was talking about. And that's what Russ was talking about. And that's what all the greats have talked about. It's more than language. It's the way you live your life. And it's the way that you speak those ideas to life. And so if uncles, you have any commentary about the co-opting of this common language, I would really, be encouraged to hear your thoughts, or other folks as well. But thank you very much. This is really, really good talk, and I really enjoyed everybody's comments. So thank you, Ashant.
Thank you, Sky. I would say that I want to resist this notion of native renaissance as well. I much prefer to think in terms of an active, vibrant, native resisting, a resisting and reclaiming of self, the Indian self, not the individual self, but the native living together self, the communityist self, if you will. I call that sometimes decolonizing. I don't pay too much attention to how other people use the word. And I know it's become common to throw it around as kind of hip, woke verbiage these days outside of the Indian world. But from within the Indian world, decolonizing has to mean resisting the whole force from the Eurochristian world that would try to reshape us as their mini-me, as their mimic, as their less than imitation. And when I talk about resisting, I'm thinking about a younger generation of Indian writers like Leon Bettasamasoki Simpson. That's the kind of resisting I'm talking about. And I'm intentionally using a verb here, resisting, and not the concomitant noun that comes out of the verb, resistance, being actively resisting. Kakuna.
Thank you, my dear niece, for your comments. As always, they bring me strength and inspiration that there is a younger generation that is thinking deeply about these issues. And so part of my deliberations are always assessing who the community is, who the audience is that I'm using terminology with, because I agree with you that that this society that commodifies everything, that cheapens everything, that reduces concepts like decolonization to a slogan can distract and divert us from our work. And when I'm talking with Indigenous people, Indigenous groups or organizations, to go to your point, I remember this passage from John Trudell, the great Dakota leader of the American Indian movement and artist, when he said, we have to think about terminology that we use. And he's talking about Indigenous people now. We have to think about the terminology that we use. We must think about thoughts that go with that terminology, because if we do not think about this struggle we are engaged in, if we do not use our minds to think about the coming generations, then the invaders will win their psychological genocide against us. And so the mindfulness that you're talking about in terms of not simply sloganeering, but to use Paulo Freire's term, the great Brazilian pedagogist, praxis, that there must be this theory or this vocabulary coupled with action. And we must, and so I would replace, if we were going to use an English term, Renaissance with resurgence, to extend Tink's remark about resistance, that resistance to oppression is not sufficient. There must be a resurgence of who we are, of who Indigenous peoples are, and the reawakening of that, and the resurgence of that in a very deliberate and mindful way. So I appreciate your comments, and I think that those are very valuable insights. Mitch.
For people who don't know, Sky and Glenn and Tink and many people on the chat today are affiliated in some way with Four Winds American Indian Council here in Denver, Colorado. And this is an example, one example of land back that Tink was involved in. So maybe we could talk about specific, tangible examples of land back. Because I think that people don't, most Euro-Christians like myself don't understand what that can mean.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, in 2015, we'd been, Four Winds had, meeting in an old Lutheran church building and an old Lutheran rectory right next door to the church. We met there for a long time, for a quarter of a century. And once, about 16, 17 years in, the Lutherans decided to reclaim the land, that is their property, and run us off. And it was the president at Four Winds at the time, the president of the council, and the council who met with the synod and argued so persuasively that the synod backed off. We didn't tell them that the American Indian movement had told us that if the Lutherans moved to kick us out of the building, they'd have a public relations nightmare on their hands, because AIM would be there to occupy the land as long as it took for the Lutherans to back down. They didn't know that, but they backed down. Then some years later, in 2015, a new bishop, a new synod council, a new bishop staff, and they had an offer to buy the property, because this is prime downtown property in Euro-Christian terms. We'd told them in the early 2000s that we had a relationship with that land. We'd buried people out of that place in ceremony. We had married people. We had celebrated sobriety anniversaries. We had planned political actions together, and we weren't about to walk away from it without a fight. By 2015, when they had this offer of $1 or $2 million for that corner piece of land, the new bishop and his staff and the council made a very different decision. In a decision that was extremely ethical. They opened up conversation with Four Winds about returning that land to Four Winds. Now, it wasn't quite that simple because it meant giving property to Four Winds. Whereas property is not an Indian notion, that's an abstraction that we don't work with easily. But it meant we were now free to have a relationship with that place in the middle of the city that was entirely our place. It was, as we'd already claimed for 25 years, Indian country. And I've told Christian groups across the continent who've struggled with the doctrine of discovery. So, okay, you have talked about the doctrine of discovery, researched it, and decided to disavow the doctrine of discovery. So, well done. But tell me, as a result of your discussion in your denomination, how much land did Indians get back? And of course, they were back to square one, having to engage that conversation all over again because they may have disavowed discovery, but the military-industrial complex didn't give a rip. They haven't disavowed discovery. They still function on the basis of Johnson v. McIntosh. And Sheldon was talking about Johnson as the most racist or one of the most racist cases. But pay attention, heads up. No Supreme Court action has ever been even entertained about reversing Johnson v. McIntosh. Think about that one for a minute. It's too important to the existence of the United States. Well, what I've told churches across the continent, denominations, if you want to do something really radical, then give land back to Indian people, because every church on Turtle Island is built on Indian land. Everyone. Kakuna.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave soon, but I wanted to say a few things before I did. And I want to acknowledge a couple of my friends on here too. Gracie Redshirt Tyon is the Director of American Indian Student Services at CU Denver. And I know that she has a lot to say about a lot of these issues too. And my friend and brother, Robert Shawnee from the Kiowa Nation. And thank both of them for joining us today. It just goes to show that we could have several conversations like this, but with regard to with regard to with the last point about reclaim, well, I think I want my concluding remark to be about this. We didn't hear from a lot of our colleagues who are maybe academics or thinking about this from another point of view. And so an obvious issue that might arise is, what Tink and Glenn are talking about are pipe dreams. I mean, talking about deconstructing the Westphalian state or talking about sovereignty in these ways. What's that the Westphalian corporate state today is the predominant paradigm in the world, and it seems insurmountable. It seems omnipotent. And so what's the point of this conversation, really? And I think that one of the parting comments that I want to make about this is that there are alternatives, and that and this goes back to Sheldon's point earlier about the sustainability of the system, environmentally, politically, economically, the sustainability of the system under which we all live or are dominated. And so what are the alternative models to that? And so there are indigenous models of kind of rhizomatic reciprocity, or what I talked about with the Maoris, or the Haudenosaunee system, which we didn't even talk about yet, about being committed and dedicated to the 7th generation from now. Other political principles that the Haudenosaunee shared with the framers of the US Constitution, but many of those principles were just too advanced for them. For example, gender reciprocity, or periodic redistribution of wealth, or the 7th generation principle that we must make political and economic and cultural decisions based on how they will impact people 7 generations from now. And so all of those elements are important to the visualization and the creation of an alternative structure to what currently exists as the dominant paradigm in the world. So we didn't really get to talk much about that. And I mean, certainly the Westphalian state system of Baudin and Hobbes and Vattel and Marshall and Schmidt, they're alive and well. We just seen it. We're seeing it now with the impeachment. You know, people in this country don't realize how close they came to the state of exception a month ago. People in the White House arguing for the declaration of martial law to impose the state of exception on the people of the United States, all of you in the United States. Those Baudinian and Westphalian and Hobbesian notions and Botero's notion of raison d'etat, they're alive and well. And the United States came within a hair's breadth of tasting it. And so the only thing that Trump lacked, he was too inept to get the Joint Chiefs of Staff on his side. And so if people think that what we're talking about in our critique of the state sovereignty system is harebrained or exaggerated or archaic, this country almost experienced it, what Native people have been talking about for generations. So my hope is that there can be additional conversations about this, and that we can really talk in depth about alternative models to the ongoing Westphalian state system that oppresses Indigenous peoples around the world. So thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. Unfortunately, I have to go teach another class. So thanks, Roger, for the invite. I can stick around for a couple more minutes.
Thank you very much.
And thanks, Carl.
Yeah. If I could say just something here as a scholar, this has been probably one of the most fascinating seminars I've had. And I think there are ways to get those who speak Westphalian to engage in ways that isn't what I would call the kind of neoliberal masked form of colonization, which is like, we want to include you in our system, which is what higher education does. But, you know, it's like, this is a matter of academics learning to listen. And I think the only way we can do that is force them to listen, because I heard a lot of resonances with what both of you were saying. I mean, I've been researching myself right now this week, you know, the whole genealogy of Odenian sovereignty and its kind of dissemination throughout Western thought. And, you know, it's been breaking apart anyway, but since we seem, in the name of something called inclusion, bring it back. And what I'm hearing is the voice of the land. You know, the word territory, that's the other word that we're using in our description for our conference. It comes from at least the Latin word for land. And to be able to hear the voice of the land, you know, it's like, this is a way of hearing and speaking that I think can percolate into academic discourse, you know, if they'll just let you in. And I think we have to start knocking louder on the door, which is one of the reasons we're trying to have this conference. So I always want to say thank you. And we not only hear you, we want you to speak louder.
I decided to stay for just to hear what Carl said, but it reminded me of something that I wanted to say in relationship to Tink's description of how the Four Winds building ended up in Native people's hands. And I want to say this in relationship, Carl, to what you just said, because it's evidence to me of how what we're talking about with regard to Indigenous people's relationship to the land can begin to resonate and move people from the invader society. And that is one of the crystallizing points for the Lutheran Synod, and I think, Tink, you'll affirm this, was their visit to the Sand Creek massacre site on the 150th anniversary of one of the most defining features in the creation of this state. And when they went to Sand Creek and the land spoke to them, and the people who were there, who were killed, spoke to them, and they admitted that they had been complicit in that act of genocide. The Lutheran Church had been complicit, and they had a duty and a responsibility not only to speak about decolonization, as my niece was talking about, but to act, and to act listening to the message from the land. And that message was, in your complicity, you must give the land back. And it's a credit to them that they listened to that moral message from Sand Creek and came back and I commend Tink. None of that would have been possible without Tink and his education, his continuing education in the community, in the Lutheran Synod about those points, and to allow them to make that connection between colonialism, their complicity in that colonialism, and one small step to begin to reverse that process. So again, I thank you all for your time and all of your work, and I look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Nemechito, metakrias.
Glenn, really good to see you and be with you, even if electronic is the only way we can do it these days.
Thank you, everybody, so much for being here, and for people who didn't speak and who were here or didn't type something. Thank you very much for being here. There were a couple of shares in the chat. Well, just as I'm ending things here, so Gracie Redshirt Tyson shared a document on decolonization not being a metaphor, which I invite you to check out. And then just a reminder, as Carl said, we are planning a conference in April, April 14th or 15th. There's a call for proposals up on the new polis right now, and we also welcome people to write pieces, and you don't need to be an academic or anything like that to be participating. We'd like to keep the conversations going in all sorts of different trajectories there. So welcome to that. Welcome to our call for proposals, and thank you very much, Tink and Glenn and everybody else for being here. Yeah, we'll end there.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Hakuna, wituwadonde kidetani.